Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, all those who have joined us at this panel on education challenges in low and middle income countries at the day 3 of What Works Global Summit 2021. I'm Sabina Singh. I'm based in India and I work as an evidence synthesis specialist at Campbell, South Asia. I'm a social anthropologist by training and I've completed my PhD from the Center of Social Medicine and Community Health. My doctoral thesis was about understanding the intersections of gender relations and other relations of power in a village of Punjab in India among agricultural workers. And I'm very pleased to chair this session on education. And we all know that education plays a very important role in empowerment, enhancing capabilities, upward mobility. But at the same time, there are certain challenges that need to be tackled. So I hope we will have some interesting insights from the presenters this evening or morning or afternoon as per your time. So let's just begin with our first presenter. But before that, let's just talk about the time allocations. I think every presenter will get about 15 minutes to present the work, and we will be taking the questions at the end. And for the attendees, you can put general chatter or your affiliations, greetings, or your research interest in the chat area. And for the questions, you might like to use the question and answer window because the questions might tend to get lost in the chat sometimes. So it would be convenient for us to locate them from the question and answer sessions. And if you feel like tweeting anything, just use the hashtags evidence for dev. And I will be just posting the hashtag in the chat so that is convenient for you. So with that, let's invite our very first speaker, Hawah Nabbuye, and she'll be presenting about educate, learning to pivot, rapid impact assessment for skill development. So over to you, Hawah.
Sabina, you're on mute.
Hawah, we can't hear you if you're speaking.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so sorry about that. And yeah, so my name is Hawah and I'm Uganda Country Director at Educate, and I'm here to discuss how Educate launched the internal rapid impact assessment system in the context of school closures due to the COVID-19 pandemic to assess effectiveness of a brand new condensed version of our flagship program, which was delivered via distance learning directly to the youth while schools were closed. This was particularly challenging to us in Uganda and also maybe in other countries because of lack of access to internet, but also to computers. So making sure that we are using phones, but also very, very basic feature phones, and also using calls, conference calls, that is direct calling, and not using things that are advanced like Zoom and what you're doing right now. And specifically, I want to talk about how, in order to capitalize on the rapid assessment, we needed to revisit our theory of change, specifically our theory of how youth build skills, to articulate our short-term indicators to measure skill development. A bit about Educate and what we do. Our purpose is to prepare youth in Africa with the skills to succeed in today's economy. And our goal from the start has been to create a model of education that is directly tied to life outcomes such as social-emotional skills, education attainment, gender equity, family planning, employment, and livelihoods. Building this model has been a process of constant experimentation and improvement to live up to our commitment to impact.
Sorry to interrupt you, Hawah, but I can't see the slides.
Yeah, let me share again. And now? Do you see the
Yes,
slides?
can see. Yeah,
Okay, great.
thanks.
All right. Yeah, so we work in a few different ways, directly working with schools through education systems, and beginning to work more with out-of-school youth. But across our three solution lines, we aim to deliver a similar core experience, which we know is effective at building youth skills. The core experience is made up of three components. One, a skills course, and secondly, the opportunity to practice new skills by starting a business with the support of a mentor, and third, competence-based assessments. Pre-pandemic, Educate delivered a flagship experience in schools at a lower and upper secondary schools. This was before schools were closed, and we served over 34,000 new students annually, working with over 8,050 schools in Uganda. And we used to work with around 40 students all the time. So this involved working with a practically youth mentor who used to deliver the program and supporting the youth within the program. So there's the course, the club mentorship, and also having assessing the students, which was practical and how they've achieved the skills within the program. Piecing this together into a bridge theory of change, these three components create a core experience which is designed to help youth build key leadership and entrepreneurial skills, which they then translate into long-term improvements in skills, economic outcomes, as well as education outcomes and gender-balanced outcomes. In Uganda, we've worked over past 9 years to test this model, which has enabled us to generate evidence. And this we launched a randomized control trial of our program starting in 2012. When we followed up at the end of the 15-month course, just before the youth completed the school, we found that students who completed the Educate program earned double the income of their peers and were more likely to own their business. These impacts were even larger for young girls and women. We didn't stop there. We wanted to see if this short-term impact translated into improvement in long-term life outcomes. And we partnered with researcher Paul Gala from UC Berkeley. We worked with Laura from the World Bank and Innovations for Poverty Action to conduct a follow-up to that randomized evaluation. And 4 years after youth left the program and 3.5 years after they completed secondary schools, researchers found that the youth who participated in the Educate program saw large persistent skills in social-emotional skills like creativity, persuasion, and grit. And participation in the program also yielded increases in educational attainment, and youth were more likely to complete secondary school, and the effect was particularly larger for girls because they were able to go on to take on science and business classes. We also saw gender impacts on gender-related outcomes, and the treatment group was less likely to have any children and have overall fewer children, as where we are at during the evaluation. So the question then becomes, given these impressive impacts, how can we scale it, either through education systems or the unique implementation environment posed by the COVID-19 pandemic? So we had a program, we had done randomized experiments, we had done quasi-experimental experiments. So we knew the program was working, but now we are faced with a challenge with the kids being in schools. And after we had to think about also, how do we measure ourselves as we change the program delivery and still maintain the same impacts? And after consulting with peers in the space, we also learned that a rapid impact assessment system would allow us to conduct rigorous rapid tests, which was connecting changes in the program delivery to changes in our target outcome. When the COVID-19 crisis hit in March, it made this even more real. Overnight, we needed to completely reimagine how to deliver our in-school program, to depend not on in-person session, but on technology and media. And in order to continue engaging the youth in their education and building critical skills, despite school closures and other challenges imposed by COVID-19, we needed one to learn and adapt quickly. We needed to create a tight feedback loop that provided rigorous information about how well our new delivery mechanisms worked quickly. Our previous impact evaluations have served us well. We've learned a lot, but how well our program has worked. But we needed a more rapid cycle to respond to the current context. Before I dive in, I want to briefly outline how our theoretical framework of how youth form skills, particularly social-emotional skills, and there are 4 distinct stages. First, youth develop knowledge. For example, on the way to developing strong citizen skills, they first must know how to classify community challenges. Next, they must begin to practice and apply the skills. For example, they might work alone or with peers to take some sort of action to solve the problem they've identified. And third, beliefs to start shift around the time application happens. For citizenship, students believe that they can be agents of change to improve their community. Fourth, finally, they arrive at a full skill development for citizenship. This means they have to think like global citizens and they have to apply. It means they have to start a project or run a business that would solve a program challenge. So this is how our program runs, and the milestone actions that we came up with is: 1, students must be able to learn after they go through the rapid program. They should be able to save, but also they should be able to act. So these milestone actions are indicators or signals that students have had a quality experience that lays the foundation for long-term skill development. They tell us that the youth have had an experience that has helped them to form skills. So I'm going to share how we use this framework, and I want to talk a bit about how we thought about adapting our in-person model to be delivered through distance learning. This was the structure of our flagship in-school model, where our solutions were delivered directly to the young youth in the classroom. However, as our understanding of remote learning evolved, we developed the idea to run boot camps that incorporate all 3 of these components. So 1, they go through a course. Secondly, they develop a business model based on market research. And third, they make their first sale. We knew we wanted distance learning model to mimic our in-person experience, so we needed parallels for each of the 3 major components. Our design team developed a structure where the course would be delivered via remote lessons, delivered via conference calls. So students, a mentor or teacher calls the students, a group of 20 students, and they are in the class via a call. By conference, I don't mean using internet, but just call to call. Students still had access to one-on-one and group mentoring, also via phone call, and would practice and apply their skills by completing projects at home. And finally, we conducted assessments via SMS. As our understanding of remote learning evolved, we developed the idea to run boot camps that incorporate all 3 of these components. In September 2020, with school shutdowns in full force, we ran a bootcamp model in the form of a 6-week conference called Best Bootcamp. The only requirement was a basic feature phone. Youth registered to participate through SMS, and we tested over 3,000 youth at a cost of $20 per person. Now, how did we assess skill development during these bootcamps? In our in-school program, our mentors were used to spending time with the youth each week, and we get a lot of detail about where they are in the skill development process, merely through interacting with youth. but that option was not possible. So we needed to devise a system that allowed us to assess youth skills remotely and evaluate competing alternatives. We did this through monitoring youth participation and answers during 4 stages in the process. 1, engagement. We had to develop systems to track youth participation. And 2, knowledge development, assessing students' skills through program delivery. 3rd, application of task-based assignments. And finally, assessing beliefs and skills through baseline and endline surveys. The first thing we want to track is to participation or engagement. In order to build a system that functions well at large scale, each mentor is given the tools and the training to track the engagement of the youth in their group. And the mentors track sessions, participation, and assignment completion for each young person. In order to graduate from the bootcamp and earn a certificate, each participant has to complete a certain number and composition of activities. This makes sure they are getting sufficient dosage of the curriculum to help us understand whether it's effectively helping young people build skills. For youth who might have trouble accessing phone sessions, we also deliver content through SMS. For those lessons, mentors don't have the ability to ask youth questions to ensure they are comprehending what they are covering. So we follow each SMS lesson with a short quiz that tests youth knowledge. And when we get the data from all the SMS assessments that the bootcamp participants take, we look at the aggregate performance of all the participants in the program to understand whether the messages are actually helping youth develop knowledge. For example, we look at how many youth answered questions incorrectly, how many scored at least 50%, and how many scored between 75 to 100% in order to understand if the materials are effective. And on top of this, we also do some sampled calls to some of these youth and to make sure that we ask them the same questions and compare those questions from the survey to the SMS lessons. By the end of the program, we do expect that the youth will have taken some milestone actions that require them to apply the skills they've started to develop. As mentioned before, this shows that they had the experience that laid the foundation for skill development. For VIP Bootcamp, we expect them to complete the following actions, which we track through our rigorous evaluations or surveys. 1, they have missions. The first mission is a community service action. The youth takes action to solve a problem in their community. And they have to give us evidence through a picture or a video where they're doing this. 2, business model. The youth develops a business model for their business they plan to start. And they share with us a picture of this business model. 3rd, financial tracking. Youth track their sales over time, and they share with us how they've been tracking and share us with evidence of this. And as the young people progress through these missions, they report back on their progress to their mentors via SMS assessments, via WhatsApp, and other available means. So another milestone is earn. So the youth begin earning income. So again here they report and also save. The youth begin saving and they have to act. So youth take 1 or more actions. They start businesses, they get a job, they do something to solve a problem in their community. Again, they have to share evidence of them having done this. We look at, when we come to understanding beliefs and skills, we look at belief and skill development for certain categories of skills where we expect movement in a short framework, like citizenship and collaboration. And the way that we understand that what young people's beliefs and skills are is by conducting phone surveys with questions about application, economic, and development of business and social emotional skills. And again, these surveys are conducted via calls. And I would like to illustrate the different measurement components I talked about in the past few slides. I'll share the results from our recent bootcamp. First, let's talk about the data surrounding the milestone actions. Over a short 5 to 6 period, the number of youth who reported owning a business, earning money, or saving anything was significantly higher at Endline. This demonstrates to us that the program successfully helped youth get to the application phase. And as they continue to run their business, save and invest, and generate income, they'll continue to build skills and advance through that skill development process. But again, this is very rapid and it's within a short period of time. And we'll definitely figure out a long term how to measure these skills. In the pilot version of the bootcamp, this change from the baseline to the endline means that one, the percentage of youth running a business increased 137% over the baseline, when 25% of the youth reported running the business. And as we experiment and solidify our program delivery structures and improve implementation, we will submit the program to more rigorous tests, but given the short-term frame, pre-post gives us a general sense of how we are doing. And we were pleasantly surprised that such short programs delivered in the way that was so drastically different from our initial model could yield these effects. And while we don't necessarily expect to see consistent movement on our skills metrics in such a short period of time, we did see some improvement of some skills over the course of the VIP bootcamp. One, for youth who met a minimum participation level over the course of the program, there were significant improvements in a few skills such as grit and an improvement in goal setting. A caveat, all these are
we can no longer see your
self-reported.
screen at this point.
Sorry?
We can no longer see your screen at this point. Presentation, yeah, it's back.
It might be the network.
Also, Hawah, you have another minute to conclude, maybe?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm summarizing. And before I wrap up, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways. Educate created our rapid impact assessment systems because we believe that all our solutions should be impact focused. Even the brand new ones we created to reach youth while schools were closed. And measuring the success of the distance learning models was difficult, not only because it was difficult to measure the skills of the young people who weren't working with in person, it was also difficult because of the nature of the variable we were trying to measure. The presence or absence of skills is not a concrete and easily quantifiable variable, so we built a system that could evaluate it from all different angles. Our theory of change illustrated a clear end goal, and measuring immediate outcomes with missions and milestones kept us on track along the way. And the data we have collected with the rapid impact assessment has been especially useful as an internal resource, which informs the design and iteration of our models. However, we hope that the rapid impact assessment system can also generate useful knowledge for our peer organizations who are looking to build iterative, innovative solutions informed by evidence. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Hawah, for presenting your work. So it has been like COVID-19 has put us all in a very strange kind of situations, and it's sort of heartwarming to see that. Of course, we have been able to, like some of us have been able to come up with some, alternatives or some innovative solutions that might help people in schools or young people who are graduating out of schools. Thank you so much. I would now invite Thomas Tiu for his presentation.
Thank you, Sabina. And thanks so much also for that interesting presentation, Hawah. I will just share my screen as well. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm presenting today on an impact evaluation of the Impact Network eSchool 360 model, which we're conducting an evaluation of with American Institutes for Research in Zambia. My name is Thomas de Hoop. I'm a program area lead for gender and social protection at American Institutes for Research. And in addition to that, I'm also a principal economic researcher. This is joint work with Hannah Ring, with Karima Sivach, with Paula Diaz, with Gelson Tembo, with Victoria Rothbart and Anais Tungui. So before I start talking about the specific evaluation, I wanted to share some details about the context of rural Zambia. What we're speaking about. We're speaking about a context where about 58.5% of the females is literate and 73% of the males. We're talking also about a context where over the last years, like a large number of community schools has been set up in rural area. It has been increased from about 100 schools in 1996 to over 2,000 schools in 2017. These community schools, however, they are often staffed by untrained, underpaid teachers, and the curriculum is not always up to speed, and there seems to be a lack of management skills and school supplies in this context. One thing that we really wanted to explore for this study, and which Impact Network, our partner here, is very interested in, is specifically also like what is the effect potentially of integrating technology into education, and how that may affect the quality of education, as well as learning outcomes in sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly in rural sub-Saharan Africa. We know from various settings that technology and education can potentially have positive effects on learning outcomes. We also know that similar programs have often failed as well. So what does Impact Network do? Basically, what they're examining is like they have an e-learning hardware program which they set up solar panels in community schools, and this is just an example of one of those community schools in rural Zambia, the Joel Impact Network School. But it's much more than a technology and education program. In addition to like the e-learning component, where teachers basically have a curriculum that is integrated into tablets with which they teach, the teachers also receive training as well as coaching through weekly management to actually integrate an active curriculum and ensure that there's activity-based learning taking place. Schools receive school supplies, their teacher stipends, and in addition to that, there's also management training as well for the teachers. So if we look at this model, the basic theory of change of the program is that like we're starting from a context where there are like low literacy rates, there are low levels of readings and mathematics achievements, and community schools are only funded with about $91 per year per school. But through various activities, including also engagement with the Ministry of Education, school renovation, teacher recruitment, and school supplies. And I have to say here, when I speak about teacher recruitment, that we're speaking about teachers from the communities, that through those activities, in combination with free education, it could help in improving the activity-based curriculum, ensuring that teachers receive professional development, which can ultimately, through improvements in child enrollment and child attendance, because the free education and improved infrastructure could also increase demand for education in the communities, could ultimately potentially lead to learning outcomes. And we're speaking here about numeracy skills, language skills, cognitive skills, and grade progression. When I'm speaking about this evaluation, we're specifically looking at children in grade 1. So we're looking at really young children who are just starting school. And our evaluation was really specifically set up to examine effects not only on those students, specifically on students who were not enrolled in school before the start of the program. So when I say numeracy skills, language skills, and cognitive skills, I'm speaking both about literacy skills, but also about pre-literacy skills as well. So what did we do? We worked with Impact Network as well as ministries in Zambia. We conducted a randomized control trial of this program with 30 treatment schools and 33 control schools. Basically, what we're speaking about here is a randomized control trial that we could implement because of resource constraints. Impact Network only had the ability to implement its program in 30 treatment schools. And power calculations suggested that we needed 33 control schools to actually determine the effect of the program with sufficient precision. We're doing this in 3 districts in Zambia, in Petaoka, in Sinda, and Katete districts. And we first, before even randomizing, actually also determined the eligibility of the schools. And the 30 and the 33 schools in the treatment and control group are also based on specific eligibility criteria. And before that, we started with initially 149 schools. Of those, 63 met the eligibility criteria. For each of the treatment school areas, we did not only look at students in the schools, but we conducted a census in each of the areas where the school was located. We determined all the households with 1 child per household, with at least 1 child of 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, and 9-year-old, the children who are generally going to the first grade in Zambia. And like when there were not enough children, we initially thought we would not include any 6-year-olds because it's less likely that they actually enroll in school than some of the 7-year-olds, the 8-year-olds, and the 9-year-olds. But in some of the villages where there were not enough 7 to 9-year-olds in the communities, we also enrolled 6-year-olds as well. Ultimately, what we're looking at is 888 households in the 30 treatment communities that we conducted baseline surveys with and midline surveys, and 977 households in the control group. So this was the randomized control trial design. We conducted AGRA, AGMA, Zambian achievement test, and oral vocabulary tests in Njanja, the local language. At baseline, we conducted 1,865 interviews. At midline, 1,700. We're speaking here about a baseline in 2018 and a midline in 2019. There was no differential attrition. And in addition to that, we also conducted qualitative data collection at midline that included key informant interviews with teachers, teacher supervisors, as well as impact network staff, as well as focus group discussions with parents, members of PTAs, parent-teacher associations, as well as students, and classroom observations. I will speak mostly about the quantitative results today, but I'll also occasionally hint at the qualitative results as well. Just one thing to keep in mind here is like the distribution of the early grade math assessment, one of the standardized tools we use to measure mathematics outcomes, and the Zambian achievement test. We very purposely actually included the Zambian achievement test because we know from previous studies that both early grade reading assessments and early grade math assessments in very early grades, such as in our context, tend to have a lot of high 0 scores. You can see that in this graph. And the Zambian achievement test is much more deliberately set up to actually be adapted to the Zambian context and to also have like a more normal distribution, as you can see in this graph. So what did we find after 1 year, I would say, and this was before COVID? We found effects basically across the board. And these are effects regardless of whether children went to school or not. Important to recognize again that we're interviewing students who were eligible to enroll in first grade. That does not necessarily mean that children actually enrolled in first grade. But we wanted to rule out self-selection effects. We estimated intention to treat effects on each of the different assessment tests that I was just introducing. We found effects of about 0.16 standard deviations on the Zambian achievement tests, of about 0.40 standard deviation on early grade reading assessments, of about 0.22 standard deviations on math assessments, and 0.25 standard deviations on oral vocabulary tests. Important to recognize here, and I will get back to that later, that while these effect sizes seem relatively large, and they're certainly statistically significant, the actual increase in the percentage of these scores was still relatively low. We present these standardized effect sizes to be able to compare them with other impact estimates, but it's important to keep in mind that these should not be necessarily considered as large impact estimates. That said, this was, of course, only the effect for those students who, it was a weighted average effect for those students who did and who did not enroll in school. When we're actually looking at those students who did enroll in school, and we assume here that like the enrollment in school is the only way in which their like impact can be estimated, we actually see larger effects for those students who actually enroll in school. This holds across the board, with impact estimates ranging from about 0.26 standard deviations for the Zambian achievement test and 0.68 standard deviations for the early grade reading assessments. So of course there are various reasons why these effects could have happened. Like the very first basic reason is of course that children actually enrolled in school. And what we saw is indeed like there was increased demand for education. The parents in the communities saw improvements in the quality of education, as we saw in the qualitative research, as well, not only, but also because of the technology in education, but also because they felt the teachers were well trained. What we saw that enrollment increased relative to the control group with about 8 percentage points, and that weekly attendance was also significantly higher. And one important thing to keep in mind here, and this again shows the importance of also interviewing students who were outside school to prevent bias, is that age at enrollment also decreased, and statistically significantly so. This impact estimate, the lower sample size is of course because we only can look at those students who actually enrolled in school. However, enrollment in school was not the only reason why students improved in learning outcomes. We also see like improvements in the perceived quality of education. We see here effects on caregiver satisfaction scores. Perhaps interestingly also, and perhaps more unexpectedly so, we also found effects on household food security. This is likely the case because education was free, which freed up expenses to actually spend on food for the household. So these food security improvements could also potentially have led to improvements in learning outcomes. We also see improvements in children's cognitive scores, as well as ultimately parents' aspirations for children's education, I should say, did not improve according to our impact estimates. All of these quantitative findings were also like confirmed in some of the qualitative research that we did. In addition to that, what we really saw in the qualitative research as well is that like teachers were more present in school. They used more active participatory pedagogical approaches, and this like was really one of the key reasons why parents also seemed to improve their perceptions of quality of education. So just to recap here, the midline results are really promising. We're going back in 2022 for our Endline survey, which is like 4 years after the midline survey. We see that multifaceted integrated technology-aided instruction programs can improve literacy and mathematics outcomes, as well as in some of the poorest areas of rural sub-Saharan Africa. Important to recognize, however, here is like I'm speaking about a technology and education program. We're also speaking about a very comprehensive technology and education program that has many elements that are in addition to technology. We're having teacher professional development, teacher training, teacher coaching. We're having a strong focus on community engagement. So this doesn't mean that just providing technology is sufficient. It's certainly what we see is that like an integrated comprehensive program can show positive effects. Various mechanisms, improvements in school enrollment and attendance, improvements in the quality of education, as well as increases in teacher attendance, were likely some of the main drivers of the positive effects. But, and I mentioned this previously, we do need to remain careful here. I previously mentioned that effect sizes, even of 0.40 standard deviations, should not necessarily be interpreted as large effect sizes, because basically what we're seeing is that even in some of the treatment schools, the impact network catchment areas, children scored an average of about 11% correct on the early grade reading assessments and 24% correct on the early grade math assessments. Clearly, still a lot of room for improvement. We will examine during the Endline study the cost effectiveness of the program. But in addition to that, we want to examine, and this is one of the main hypotheses, we want to test whether learning outcomes actually increase exponentially. The effects I just looked at, like, were really one-year effects. We're hoping to see at least sustainable effects, but like one thing that the Impact Network team really hopes to achieve is also positive effects after 4 years of programming that go much beyond 11% correct on early grade reading assessments and 24% correct on early grade math assessments. At the same time, we're also speaking about a context where COVID-19 has severely disrupted education. So we will need to take that into consideration in the interpretation of the Endline findings, and see whether there was any indication of learning loss after COVID-19, of course. Children at the Endline, we deliberately selected the Endline survey to actually take place at least after the students were again in in-person education for about a year in Zambia, to make sure that COVID would not disrupt our impact evaluation too much. And that's why we postponed the Endline survey by a year. Thanks very much. The final thing that I wanted to say is that we will conduct a cost effectiveness of the program. A non-experimental study shows some evidence for low costs and high cost effectiveness in comparison with government schools. Often we get a question on this evaluation whether the comprehensiveness of the education program also has high costs associated with it. That's not necessarily the case if you look at this comparison, at least from non-experimental evidence. We will see whether that is also the case when we conduct a similar cost effectiveness analysis during the Endline survey as well. Thanks very much. I'm looking forward to the other presentations. Thank you.
So thank you, Thomas, for your presentation. It was very interesting, and I hope we see similar or better outcomes at the Endline, like after the Endline is completed. So I was also interested in sort of course, if the time permits, we would get back to this, but the importance of trained and knowledgeable teachers, and I was just wondering that in countries where the teacher-student ratio is very low, this definitely has implications on education and other indicators of development. So that is something that struck me. So moving on to the next presentation now. So the last presentation of the session is by Rajani, Shrestha, and Paulette Assaf, and they are presenting on rapid education risk analysis with limited operational evidence. Thank you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Wait. I think you can. Paulette, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. Okay. So let me start just by a brief introduction, and I guess Rajani and I will be mindful of the time since we have to close this session in about 15 to 16 minutes. My name is Paulette Assaf. I am the Deputy Chief of Party for World Learning in Lebanon for a USAID-funded project called the Kitabi 2. Rajani?
Yeah?
Would you like to introduce yourself before we proceed?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Rajani Shrestha, and I'm the project director of the Kitabi 2 project that we're implementing in Lebanon, and I'm based in Washington, D.C.
Okay, so basically, Kitabi 2 is the third educational project led by USAID in Lebanon, and it targets primary education in particular. Our presentation today is about a rapid education risk analysis that was performed last year during the COVID pandemic in the country. Our agenda for the day will cover an overall context of the country so that you would know where we are operating, the framework of the study itself, the methodology that was used, and we will share with you some findings and the risk areas that we are to consider in our programming. So an overview of Kitabi 2. It spans over a period of 5 years, from 2019 until 2024. It aims at improving reading outcomes and math outcomes for grades 1 to 6 students in public schools. We operate in around 1,307 schools, part of which do teach what we call before noon time. So this is the first shift, and some of them in the second shift, which targets students in the afternoon. And we do also work with some private schools which are subsidized by the government of Lebanon as well. The overall population is more than 300,000 students. In that context, it is worth noting that the overall population of students in Lebanon is around 1 million. The project has 3 outcomes. The first one is about literacy and numeracy. The second one is about social and emotional learning. And the third one is about strengthening the system of the Ministry of Education and Higher Education and its units and departments in order to bring education to a higher level of efficiency, hopefully. So next slide. Since 2019, and I can't say that it has been much, much better before that, we have been witnessing compounding crisis. So I'm going to go over a very short brief of the recent past. In 2019, we had in July, we had the start of a financial and economic crisis. We had short liquidity of US dollars in the country, and we are referring to the US dollar in particular because our economy is dollarized. We have a devaluation that has witnessed up until today the value of 90%. So the dollar that was worth 1,500 lira in July 2019 is today worth 20,000 lira. Shortly after that, in October, we've witnessed people in the street, and we refer to it as the October uprising, which still has an impact up until today. It is worth noting that while I'm speaking to you now, and because of the fact that fuel prices have risen in the market by 25%, people are on the streets. Some roads around our offices are blocked, and we're hoping that the situation will not escalate, although nobody can be sure about that. In 2020, February, like everybody else in the world, we were hit by the pandemic. Fortunately, we've witnessed 3 waves up until today, and our numbers are not dramatic. We have around 600 to 700 cases per day since August 2021. However, it is worth noting that the health system is under stress. So, and this is because of the financial and economic crisis. In August 2020, we had the 3rd largest explosion that has happened since World War II. And this has affected more than 300,000 houses. And as far as the education system, around 160 schools were damaged as a result of the explosion. I was hoping to say that the current situation is becoming better. However, we have a new government, and the new government is struggling to overcome political conflict and socioeconomic crises that are everlasting since the year 1975, with a bit of moments of peace here and there from 1992 until the year 2005. We still have on the education sector a lot of challenges to overcome. And this particular study, which Rajani will explain from the next slide onward, we're working with the sector so that we see little improvements with the children. Rajani, over to you.
Thanks, Paulette. So why do an education risk assessment? The crisis that with the series of crises that Paulette just described, we find ourselves in a situation where there has been inconsistent schooling for last 2 years. Of course, during COVID year in 2020, the ministry and projects like Kitabi did pivot to online teaching, and internally we debate, is it online teaching or distance teaching? But because the majority of teachers are using their cell phones, but it's not consistent. And and last year, more than 30,000 students moved to the public schools. It's just important to note that historically, only 30% of the student population went to public schools. Majority, 70%, went to private schools, because there's this perception that the education in the public schools is not good. But now, with the financial situation, families cannot afford the fees, and therefore are moving to the no-fee public schools. During last year, the dropout of students, also from coming from the low socioeconomic backgrounds, had reached about 45%. And just another thing to note is that even though there has been inconsistent schooling for the last 2 years, the students were still promoted to the next grade. So with that, these are our research questions. We were looking at, what are the contextual risks to education? What groups are affected? Who is being left out? And, what sort of resilience and coping strategies are being deployed at the school level? We interviewed teachers and school administrators, and there is innovation. People have adapted and used coping strategies. So we try to dive into that a little deeper. And then finally, what are the opportunities to address the risks? Where can collaboration be strengthened? How can one project build on other projects' work, so that we can reach the maximum number of students? Our method is it's a qualitative research. Ideally, in an ideal world, we would have liked to do both quantitative and triangulate through a qualitative method, but majority of the study was done in 2020, and all of the interviews were done online. There were a lot of limitation and adaptations that we had to do. So ultimately, the qualitative research was the route to go. It helped us get really deep into the nuances of the system. So we collected data through semi-structured, open-ended interviews. We spoke to INGOs, government agencies, specifically the Ministry of Education, and school-based practitioners, so teachers and school administrators. The sample was purposive. We had 50 respondents, and it's purposive because the people that we interviewed from the government or from the schools were all familiar with one of these topics, either curriculum and pedagogy for reading, math, social emotional learning, teacher training, and then overall government policy and response to crisis. So our study, I would say, is divided into three distinct phases. We had three distinct phases. First, because everything shifted online, we spent majority of the time at the beginning of 2020 on a really deep dive into the literature, the gray literature, published literature, to really see, what are the gaps, what questions do we need to answer in light of the current situation, and it really helped us narrow our focus. Once we complete the phase of literature review is when we engaged with the ministry. We shared with them the findings of the desk review. We had additional inquiry of focus, and really made a case of primary data collection. So the third phase is when we interview the 50 respondents, and all of the interviews was one-on-one interviews. We didn't do focus group discussions, mainly because it was all over Zoom and very hard to manage. So that was our method. And before I turn it to Paulette to share the findings, just to share that we have organized our findings by INAE standards, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergency, and using that framework helped us to see the risks across within the domains and across the domains. Paulette?
Yes. So effectively, what are the findings regarding access and the learning environment? Let me start by saying that the whole country was not prepared for distance learning or online learning. And only privileged students in private schools had access to some sort of a learning management system before the pandemic. So once hit by the pandemic and everybody got at home, learning at home, the ministry and ourselves, we worked hard in order to provide resources to publish on platforms that were made available by the ministry. However, the children did not have access to digital devices. And the little digital devices they had access to were the mobile phones from their mothers and fathers. So with the lack of electricity, the lack of connectivity, the challenges of the education of the of the financial situation, it's normal to find out that only children with access to some smart devices would have been able to follow the synchronous learning activities that were offered by the teachers. In one home of 3 children, it is also normal to witness that only the elder children could get attention from the father or the mother, and that younger children from grades 1 to 3 in particular had little access to online learning. While having access to online learning, and because it was done so fast, there were no guidelines to safeguard the children from online bullying that were developed. These were developed with time today, but they were not developed in an appropriate time. And last but not least, there was a lack of social and emotional learning practices that was done over the online platforms. Syrian refugee children and children with special needs were the most affected among the most marginalized children from these particular practices. Next slide. On a teaching and learning aspect, our curriculum dates from 1997. It is outdated. It does not accommodate for online or distance learning, and it does not promote effective teaching that incorporates social and emotional learning, and is rather more lenient on memorizing and traditional learning by the teacher. We are working with public schools in order to introduce new methods of learning. However, during COVID, we found ourselves just stuck with the normal or the traditional ways of learning. Formative assessment is incorporated, but it is hard to follow over WhatsApp or over mobile phones. And during these past 2 years, or even before, training and professional development for teachers was really, really limited, if not absent at all.
Okay, so on teachers and other education personnel, which includes principals and school administrators, what we found from our interviews is that there is really limited involvement of school-based stakeholders. So as strategies are written, plans are written, even when it came to pivoting to the online space, they weren't really consulted, and they're really often seen as those that they deliver the knowledge. So oftentimes it's really top down, and they're not really part of the conversation. The teaching qualification is not compulsory for contract teachers. And just to understand, in Lebanon, there are 2 categories of school. Like Paulette was mentioning at the beginning, you have the morning shift that is primarily for the Lebanese students, and then the afternoon shift is for Syrian students. And within the morning shift, there are 2 types of teachers, the full-time tenure teachers who are paid by the ministry and also get all of the benefits like Social Security. And then the contract teachers, also paid by the ministry, but their contracts are renewed every year. They don't get the benefits, but they also don't need to have the teaching qualification. In the afternoon shift is all contract teachers that also don't need to have the teaching qualification, but their salary is paid by donor agencies through the ministry channels, but it's not through ministry funding. So the teaching qualification not being compulsory, of course, affects the quality of the education. There is overall a lack of resources. Honestly, I really feel for the teachers. There's a lot that they had to take on during the last 2 years in Lebanon. The principals shared difficulty in operating the schools. If you don't have electricity, you don't have generator, what is the purpose of all of this online learning? There is, or how do you even execute it? Connectivity issues. They have the buses, but don't have access to fuels. But just, these are a lot of the challenges that they were sharing. Teachers oftentimes supplemented materials using their own income, and the teacher's salary is really dismal. They're making less than $3 an hour because of the financial crisis and the devaluation of the Lebanese lira. On education policy, here we are really talking about at the systems level, more at the central level. There is a room for improvement, I would say, when it comes to interministerial coordination and intraministerial coordination. There definitely was some lost opportunities to improve, let's say, the connectivity services. Had there been better coordination between the Ministry of Education and Telecommunication, that could have been one area that could have been resolved, hopefully, and even within the ministry units. And we've been working in Lebanon since 2013, and I would say there has been a lot of improvements. Key units are talking to each other, but definitely there is room for improvement. Overall, not surprising, like a lot of countries like Lebanon, it's quite centralized, the bureaucracy. And oftentimes, like I mentioned earlier, teachers are not really part of the conversation. And the language policy does affect also outcomes, learning outcomes. In Lebanon, the second language is introduced early on in grade 1. And the mother tongue is Arabic, but then math and science are taught in either English or in French. And finally, the responses to crisis is really top down, and it's very reactive and not proactive. And so it begs the question, how much, to what degree are we preparing schools for crisis and the system to respond to crisis? So finally, we'll wrap it up with the risk sources. Paulette?
Yes, so the risk sources that have been identified by the study are lost learning of 2 years for the children who have access to education, but were promoted automatically, and we are afraid that they did not acquire the appropriate skills that are needed for their particular grade. Of course, we should look at the post-trauma stress that was affecting children and parents at the same time. Children because of their staying at home, not meeting their friends, and parents because of the socio-economic crisis we are in. Teachers because they're not really recognized in the systems, but as deliverers of knowledge, and they're not included or part of the change mechanism for curriculum reform. And as well, the exclusion of the vulnerable children in learning and the non-access to education at their appropriate levels. Last but not least, a fragile education governance structure because of the lack of communication and the stronger mechanisms that are conducive for an effective change and efficient education at the national level. Apologies for wrapping up just very quickly because we are mindful of the time. And I'll leave it up to the moderator to see this, how to conclude the session.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rajani and Paulette, for keeping with the time. And thanks so much for sharing your insights about this research. And my personal opinion is that, of course, qualitative and quantitative together give the kind of, best of both worlds. But I'm equally in support of either of the ones given the situation. And my personal preference is towards the qualitative, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a social anthropologist, so I really enjoyed your presentation, and of course, Thomas and Hawah's presentations also. So I would just, before I sort of sum up the presentations, there's a question for Rajani and Paulette. So this question is that when children move to the no-fee public schools, are they in the children's same communities, or does this mean the children need to leave home and move elsewhere?
No, they do come from the same community because in the system in Lebanon, private schools are really spread over the country as much as the public school. But we have a custom of private schools that are subsidized by charity or faith-based associations. They're well spread. They follow the Lebanese curriculum. But people do prefer to send their children to these, even if they come from a less socially advantageous societies.
Okay, so thank you for responding to that. So I'll just try to sum up the entire session. So given the time constraint, I would be really brief. So some of the key points that I could take up from these presentations was that importance of teachers from both Thomas and Rajani and Paulette's presentation, that it's really important to invest in the teachers, the way they are paid, engaging them in the planning process, any programs that we design for education of children, teachers must be involved in that process. And and especially with respect to the last presentation in the crisis situation and otherwise as well, we need to have bottoms up approach rather than the top down, without taking into consideration all the stakeholders. And I hope Thomas, Ari, the online results are also very promising, as the midline seemed to make some positive change in the lives of children. And about Hawah's presentation, I would say that it was like nice to see that with every crisis comes some opportunities, some some opportunity to think out of box, some opportunities to come with innovative solutions. So with that, I think I would wrap up this session, and some kind of keywords that I just got from this presentation was the digital divide, the increasing inequalities, heterogeneous. One thing that I sort of found particularly interesting, which is true for other groups of population also, that the children are not a homogeneous group of population, they are heterogeneous. So for example, as in Rajani and Paulette's presentation, they mentioned that certain groups of children like refugees, they could be more vulnerable. And I think I've summed up a bit, but I hope we meet again, and thank you again for presenting at this forum, and hope to see you somewhere sometime.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.